Hello, and thank you for joining today's NCCN patient webinar, Why Should I Consider a Clinical Trial? My name is Tanya Fisher, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. NCCN stands for National Comprehensive Cancer Network. NCCN is a not-for-profit alliance of 33 leading cancer centers across the United States devoted to patient care, research, and education. NCCN Foundation is a nonprofit organization that raises funds for NCCN patient resources, including new and updated patient guidelines, as well as patient webinars. These are funded using financial support from generous donors. The NCCN guidelines for patients are based on the NCCN clinical practice guidelines used by healthcare providers worldwide. They explain the same options for cancer care, but are written for patients and their caregivers, family, and friends. You can view and download free copies of the guidelines for patients from the NCCN website. High quality printed copies of the book can be purchased through Amazon. The NCCN patient webinars complement the NCCN guidelines for patients, and they cover a series of topics discussed by expert presenters. Viewers have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentation. And so this brings us to today's webinar. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Colin Weeks. Dr. Weeks is Director of Medical Oncology Research for Pancreatic Cancer at Mass General Cancer Center. Following Dr. Weeks, we'll hear from Tiffany Colvin. Tiffany is Senior Director of Clinical Trial Operations at Fred Hutch Cancer Center. And our third presenter today is Ann Fish-Stiegel, Patient Advocate and Senior Vice President of Patient Services and Healthcare Delivery at Longevity. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Weeks.
Thank you for having me today. As I said, I'm Colin Weeks from Massachusetts General Hospital. My focus is research-wise is on clinical trials. As you may know, there are a number of clinical trials that exist. For today's conversation, we're going to focus primarily on treatment or therapeutic trials. And so these represents the sort of historical treatments for patients with cancer. So initially, surgery was the choice that was used, and that's back in ancient times. And the premise was that you cut the tumor out and hopefully the patient didn't have to deal with cancer anymore. And unfortunately, that isn't always the case. In the late 1800s, radiotherapy was then applied to treating patients with cancer. And it's important to note that both surgery and radiation therapy are local treatments for cancer. So in other words, wherever the knife is placed or the radiation beam is targeted, that's all that's being treated in these modalities. If the cancer has spread beyond the local area organ of origin, now we're talking about systemic therapy or drugs. And so in the 1940s, cytotoxic chemotherapy was originated, and these drugs alter DNA function, they damage DNA, and that's how they work, generally speaking. In the 1990s, we developed molecular therapies, and molecular therapies are based upon some characteristic of the cancer cell that's unique to it, that can then be targeted, and really began to bring in the age of precision medicine. And then most recently, we've had the age of immunotherapy, and this is utilizing the immune system to actually treat the cancer. And so the drugs that we use to engage the immune system do just that. They turn on the immune system, but the actual immune system itself is the actual treatment modality. And then in more recent times, in the last year or two, we've now begun to use engineered cells within the immune system, so engineered T cells or engineered NK cells as a treatment modality for patients. So what are the different phases of clinical trials? So they're listed here, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. I think for what I'll do is I'll talk about this the way that I would talk to it in terms of one of my patients. So I usually start at the bottom of the list, which is a phase 4 trial. So phase 4 trials are once a drug has been approved by the FDA and they're now in the general population, they're assessing whether the drug remains safe, and whether the benefit that they have appreciated for this particular drug holds true in the general population. Phase 3 trials are what have been historically used to get drugs approved by the FDA. Like when I was a kid, we used to hear on the evening news there were these randomized controlled trials where patients receive either placebo versus the experimental drug, or standard of care versus standard of care plus the experimental drug. In general, the outcome that's associated with these particular types of trials are survival, some measurement of survival, and these are usually large, hundreds of patients type trials. A phase 2 trial is really the beginning to understand where a drug or a treatment, how it works in a specific patient population. So, for example, you take patients with metastatic pancreas cancer who have a mutation in KRAS, and now we're giving those patients a KRAS inhibitor as their first line of therapy. And so that's a specific group of patients or population of patients, a specific therapy, and a specific component of their treatment paradigm. In phase 1 trials, these are the initial trials looking at safety and tolerability of a given medication or a combination of medications. The goal of these studies is to determine the side effects associated with the medication, as well as determine the safe dose to move forward into the phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So, why are clinical trials important? So the bottom line is that this is how we define the standard of care for patients. And this is how we improve the outcomes for patients. And ultimately, in some cases, are able to mediate cures for some patients. So participation in clinical trials is also important in the fact that it's been demonstrated that patients who participate in clinical trials in general have a better outcome than those patients who do not. So why is diversity important? I think the main thing that we want to be able to state is that the patients that are represented in a clinical trial represent the population of patients who have the disease. And so in other words, if you are focused on if your patient population is very homogeneous, then the benefit that's associated with that particular treatment is really only applies to the patient, this homogeneous population of patients who were treated on the trial. And we have seen in historically that um, the importance of diversification of patients on trials in terms of thinking that a drug works in a certain group of patients, and particularly I'm thinking about lung cancer, and then only to realize that another group of patients with with a similar disease do not derive benefit from uh, that one drug. It's also important to think about personalized care. So at the end of the day, if we're able to have a diverse populations on trials, we may be able to see certain patient populations who are benefiting from the therapy that we're looking at, and be able to sort of develop the therapeutic or the drug development plan for that patient population. But we wouldn't necessarily see that if we didn't have a diverse population of patients. Ultimately, as we increase the diversity of patients who are treated on trials, the capacity to ultimately improve the outcomes for the general population is increased. So I find that this particular slide very sort of humbling. And so in 1971, the President Nixon declared the war on cancer. And if you look at sort of the burden of cancer and who is mediating the burden of cancer, they're asking this question looking at the mortality to incidence ratio. So what this is saying is that um, for every person that's diagnosed with cancer in a given year, what is the mortality associated with that? And so what you can see here on the left is from the years 2000, 2005, that patients of who were Black had an increase burden associated with cancer. If you ask that same question 20 years later, you see basically the same outcome that you saw previously, which is that patients of color have an increased burden of cancer. And so really, if you extrapolate to today, so over the course of the 50 years of the NCI's existence, unfortunately, the burden of cancer is higher in the same populations as it was back 50 years ago. I think this is a very humbling statement, and it also forces us to rethink sort of how we're doing things in terms of improving outcomes for patients. So this particular slide highlights this with specific cancers. So we're looking at patients who either have liver cancer, multiple myeloma, or prostate cancer. In the top set of bar graphs, you're looking at the percent of patients who have, let's say, liver cancer based upon race. So green is white, yellow is black, the lighter blue is Asian population, and the royal blue is Hispanic population. And really the crux of this slide is actually in the bottom half. So the bottom half shows the percent representation of these different races in a pivotal clinical trial. So a pivotal clinical trial means that this is a trial that impacted the outcome of patients in a way that maybe was practice changing. And so you can see, for example, for folks who are Black with liver cancer, it represent about 12% of patients. But only 2% of patients actually were on this trial. So you can extrapolate that even if those 2% of patients were cured, right? We still have another 10% of patients who actually are still dealing with the disease because they weren't even on the trial. So you can see just simply by if we can increase the number of patients who are on these pivotal trials, we can significantly increase the outcomes for patients simply by demonstrating that in these pivotal trials. So then what are the barriers associated with participation in clinical trials? And I think simplistically put, it's a situation of resources, right? So it's the lack of resources in various components that result in barriers to trials. And the solution is to provide those resources in various aspects. So if you look at the patient-related barriers, you're talking about transportation, the cost to participate in a study, the burden that caregivers bear to support their loved ones as they go through their journey with cancer, time toxicity, hours away from work, hours away from doing the things they like to do, um, language barriers, education barriers, health literacy barriers, and then lack of awareness. So often patients don't know what trials are available to them or what clinical research opportunities are available to them that may impact their care. This also happens at the doctor's level or the physician's level, clinician level, which is lack of awareness. So lack of awareness that the patient may even want to participate in a clinical trial, lack of awareness of what particular trials may be available to their patient. I think we all have to recognize that we have some degree of implicit bias, and not recognizing that is really important in this conversation. And then I think cultural insensitivity is important. This reflects the capacity of one to sort of exist in an environment they don't normally exist in, and to do that in a respectful way. And then there are also institutional barriers, right? So lack of clinical trial sites. So what that means is that, historically, the ivory towers of the academic centers, patients have to come to those towers and navigate those towers. But maybe the solution to that is actually to do the reverse. The informed consent process is very complicated, and so I'm going to actually in the next few slides show some things that we might be able to do to address that. Eligibility criteria. So historically, the eligibility criteria have inadvertently discriminated against some patient populations, and now that in the last few years we've recognized that, and I do think that we're doing a better job of not introducing discriminatory components within the eligibility criteria for clinical trials. And then medical distrust. Although I think this still exists, I think it's actually improving. So there are a number of studies that demonstrate that if you take a patient of color and if they are offered a clinical trial, they will enroll in that clinical trial at the same rate as their white counterparts. So although I do think medical distrust still exists, it is not as big of a barrier it has been in the past. So I said to overcome these barriers, we then have to present resources to overcome these barriers. So if we go back down the list, we look about patient-related solutions. This is providing transportation, and so now in clinical trials, many sponsors of trials will provide either transportation vouchers or they'll even reimburse patients for their transportation. This concept of decentralization of trials, and what that means is bringing the clinical trial to the patients. So what we've seen recently is that some drugs that were developed as IV medications are now being developed as subcutaneous medication so that they can be delivered at home. Also thinking about, taking labs, doing the lab draws at home versus the patient having to come into the hospital system for that. Um, it's very common in many of the medical centers where you have extended hours. So this allows for patients to come to the clinic to get their care either before or after their work day, so that they don't miss time and resources associated with missing work. Uh, the use of translators and patient education is really important, right? So this has to do with providing information to patients in a way in which they can receive it, either through making sure they have the appropriate language to receive the information that's being provided to them, as well as can we simplify the information in a manner to which they can receive what's being talked about. So, from a doctor's point of view, education and training is important, both in terms of doctors recognizing the things that they may be doing either verbally or non-verbally that um, that may be a hindrance to patients wanting to engage with them in terms of their demonstrating that they want to participate in a clinical trial, as well as um, educating physicians and clinicians about their own implicit bias, so that when it does happen, maybe they can recognize it and develop strategies to address that within themselves. And then cultural competency is, I think, really important, and it has to do with all the things that we just said. But at the end of the day, it's a measure, or it's the capacity for an individual to function in an environment that's not their normal environment. So an example might be, I currently live in Boston, and if I was then to go to rural Nebraska and, hang out in rural Nebraska, would I be able to navigate that situation? Would I be able to respectfully the barriers, or what are the sort of life experiences that those individuals um, are experiencing that may impact their care? And then institutional, structural level, we want to increase clinical trial locations. So we want to bring the trials out to patients versus the patients having to come to the institutions. And in these days, many institutions are developing sites for care outside of the major hospital, and really thinking very carefully about where they're placing those sites and who and what communities are being served by those sites. Patient navigation is important. If we just use the same example I just said, a person comes from Nebraska to Boston to get their care for some novel trial, the patient has to navigate the foreign territory of Boston, and then also has to try to navigate this huge hospital that they're going to try to walk into. And so having patient navigation, or having tools for patients to get through the system, is really important to decrease the anxiety associated with that. So in terms of in terms of the criteria for clinical trials, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So I want to now talk about community partnerships, and what I mean by this is the respectful two-way engagement of the academic centers with the communities that they serve, to understand what might be some of the life experiences that these individuals are having to navigate in order to get their care within our system, and also then to think of how our system can help the community navigate some of those things. Is there ways in which the academic center can reduce some of the barriers that exist? But they only can know that if they know what the actual barriers are, and they can then develop impactful measures to address that. I think it's also important to think about relationships with our pharmaceutical or other industry partners that support cancer care. It's only through that these partnerships, for example, now um, sponsors of clinical trials are providing travel reimbursement for patients, right? That's only because there's been an ongoing communication amongst the various players in the situation. And really thinking about within communities, what are novel approaches that we can use that are community focused to help patients understand the process of clinical trials, understand the benefits, understand the potential negative aspects of participating in a trial, which there are some. And so it's really important as we move forward to really be able to have a respectful two-way engagement amongst these different players. So, right. So what I want to show here um, is a video that I did, which explains a clinical trial, phase 1 trial, in sort of very simplistic terms. And the concept here is to be able to have patients and their caregivers and family review the video before doing the consent. And the concept of the video is to provide the patients with the information about the trial, once again, in a relatively simplistic way, and in a way in which they can receive the information. So you can go to this YouTube site and click on it and see the video, and you can get a better sense of what I'm talking about. So as I said before, we've really sort of changed the inclusion exclusion criteria, the entry criteria for clinical trial. There's inclusion criteria, which means that you have to meet all of these criteria to participate in a trial. These are basically focused on, does the patient have the disease in which is being studied? Do they have normal or relatively normal kidney, liver function, bone marrow function, lung function, heart function? Those are sort of the very common inclusion criteria. And then there's also exclusion criteria, and exclusion criteria means that you cannot have any of these particular criteria. And these are also circled around making sure that the patient has a disease that's being treated, that they have not received prior treatment that would not be appropriate when considering the clinical trial that's being considered for the patient. And then sometimes there are things like what are called intercurrent illnesses. And so this is where there's been historically some discrimination, where we sort of, there's a group of patients that have not been allowed to participate in trials historically. That's now changed. And so we're seeing that those patients are really thriving on clinical trials. And so being really thoughtful about what are the exclusion criteria that we're putting into these studies to make sure that we're not inappropriately discriminating against any particular individuals. So we are now in the era of precision medicine. And what does precision medicine mean? Precision medicine is this concept of developing therapy specifically for an individual patient. And as we have moved into the realm of molecular therapies and immunotherapies and applying technology to patients, we're now in the area or arena in clinical care where we can design therapies for patients. So, for example, if we take 5 patients that have pancreas cancer, and if each one of those 5 patients has a different mutation in their cancer, and for each one of those different mutations, there's a drug that can be used to target those mutations, then you can see how each one of those patients are having a personalized therapy for their particular cancer. But as a whole, the patient population with pancreas cancer actually benefits. And so this is the sort of the holy grail going forward in terms of how we take care of cancer patients. That's why you'll see now studies that are sort of based upon a particular mutation. So a very hot topic in today's world would be KRAS mutant cancers. So KRAS is a very common mutated gene in a number of cancers: colon cancer, lung cancer, pancreas cancer. And so now there are a number of drugs that target KRAS in various ways. So I'm gonna And so then there's also the possibility of developing unique therapeutic targets utilizing personalized medicine. So this particular slide is focusing on ancestry or genomics, and trying and sort of saying, okay, if patients in a certain part of the world who have the same genomics, may they have a different disease, a different form of breast cancer than, say, a patient in a different population, a different portion of the world. So, for example, if you take patients from West Africa who have a BRCA mutation, so that's the breast cancer related mutation that results in patients, if you're born with that mutation, you have an increased risk of developing breast cancer. That has historically been associated with patients in the Jewish population, but has now been shown that there are patients from West Africa who have a BRCA mutation. It's a different mutation, but they have the mutation nonetheless. And so these patients are, both groups of patients are at risk for developing breast cancer. But interestingly, the mutation, or where the mutation occurs in the gene, is different in these different populations of patients. Now, going back to what I said about participation, So the tests that we currently use to do those to look for those mutations, they're based upon hotspots, and those hotspots have been defined based upon the patients who have previously been tested. Well, these previous tests have been done a lot on um, patients of the Jewish population, Caucasian population. So the tests are going to pick up the mutations in those patients. If you apply that same test to these patients in West Africa, you may see either a negative test or what's called a variant of unknown significance, meaning that they find a mutation, but because it's so infrequent, they don't know what it actually means. But it's really because this population of patients weren't part of the initial group of patients who were used to develop the test. And so you can now see how um, the diversification of participation in studies is important. In addition, it may also be that the patients in West Africa with breast cancer versus the Jewish population of patients, and I'm now just sort of talking just to give an example, there may be differences in their cancer. So it could be that the patients with the breast cancer in the African population may have a sort of what's called an inflammatory cancer, in which case immune therapy may be important for that patient population, where it may not be important in this other population, although they have the same gene that's altered. So as we learn more about genetics and we are able to then apply these different technologies to understand the cancers better, what's ultimately going to happen is that we're going to realize that cancer is not the same disease, right? So we've already think that if you take 5 patients, go back to my analogy before, you take 5 patients with pancreas cancer, if they all have a different mutation in their cancer, then it's really 5 different diseases. If you then extrapolate that a little bit further, and go in terms of genomics, where there's some degree of consistency amongst a group of patients, that these different populations of patients, based upon their genomic backgrounds, they may also have different diseases, even though they have the same mutation. And so it's going to be really important as we move forward in the care of cancer patients and move more and more toward this idea of personalized medicine, with the idea that we ultimately impact each individual patient's cancer at a higher level, then the population of patients with that cancer ultimately will also all benefit um, from the treatments that we're designing. So I just want to finish with this last slide, which is what's my why, right? And I mentioned stop the cycle, right? We want to ultimately stop the cycle of various populations within the United States having an increased burden of cancer. And I think actually, if we can able to decrease the burden for those individuals, will actually decrease the burden for all individuals with cancer, which has a number of potential benefits in terms of economic benefits, in terms of just the health of our population, and on many levels. So, with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and thank you for listening to me this morning. And I will turn it over to Tiffany Colvin to sort of go in the next section.
My name is Tiffany, and I work at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. Today, I want to share who works behind the scenes on clinical trials and share some truths about participating in clinical trials. I have worked in clinical research for over 20 years now, holding various roles. I sort of stumbled into clinical research and never left the field. I was working in a hospital and I struck up a conversation with a patient on a clinical trial, and it was benefiting him. And that was exciting. And that led me to ask more questions. And before I knew it, clinical research became a passion that is near and dear to me. And I'm excited to share some of my insights. Let's start with the clinical research team, also known as the study team. This team may include individuals who are not located in the clinic, but play a critical role in the success of a clinical trial. These roles include regulatory, data management, monitoring, budget and contracts, quality assurance. These individuals ensure everything runs smoothly behind the scenes. Patient advocates are also an essential part of the team. We're going to hear from Anne in a bit here. They are patient-facing, but they are also involved behind the scenes in protocol review process of clinical trials, ensuring that the patient's voice is heard and considered in the research process. On the patient-facing side, you will see individuals such as physicians, research coordinators, nurses, pharmacists, lab technicians. All these roles are trained on the research protocol and well-versed in the protocol procedures and the treatment being given. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 12 clinical truths in 12 minutes, so let's get started. First and foremost, we want you to know you are not an experiment. You're not a guinea pig or a test tube, and saying those terms is very uncomfortable since we don't associate them with clinical research anymore. Having said that, while there have been historical events where this was the case, we have come a long way in clinical research and the protections of human subjects. And this is not how we treat people anymore. Those on a clinical trial will always receive the standard of care, which is the accepted treatment for your condition. You can leave a clinical trial at any time and still receive a standard of care option. And it's important to know being a part of a clinical trial does not impact your rights or welfare. Placebos can be a scary word to hear when discussing treatment options and are rarely used alone in cancer clinical trials. They're often combined with other treatments. If that trial involves a placebo, the design is clearly outlined in the consent document for review. So here's one example of a randomized clinical trial design involving a placebo and how that may look. And so in this design, there are two treatment arms. In treatment arm A, participants receive the FDA-approved drug. That's what we would refer to as the standard of care, which is plus the study drug being tested, that investigational agent. And then in treatment arm B, participants receive the FDA-approved standard of care drug and a placebo. For some trials, and this is always a great question to ask, if the disease progresses in treatment arm B, some trial designs allow for patients to roll over to treatment arm A and still receive the investigational agent being studied. Truth number 5, clinical trials are designed to minimize risk and ensure patient safety through strict adherence to guidelines and regulations. Participants are closely monitored for any changes in their condition, and accurate data collection is critical for decision making. Clinical trials may involve additional procedures like scans, EKGs, blood works, which are covered by the study if they go beyond standard of care. Long-term follow-up, often spanning 10 years, is conducted to monitor for any long-term side effects. And I want to briefly just highlight the SAE 24-hour window for reporting. SAE stands for serious adverse event. If a patient experiences a serious adverse event, such as being admitted to the hospital, the research team has 24 hours to report that to the sponsor or the individual conducting the trial and collecting the data. This quick reporting helps to minimize risk and ensure patient safety if multiple SAEs are reported. So there's this trial is run in all 50 states, and something happens in Florida, and then something happens in Missouri, and then something happens in Washington. The sponsor's going to see all these reports, and that quick reporting helps minimize because the sponsor can identify patterns and take steps to pausing enrollment or amending the protocol or looking at a different dose for the patients that are on this treatment. There are many reasons why clinical trial participants may choose to be on a trial. The choice is individual and it depends on what is best for their care. So here I have a lot of reasons, and I've had many conversations with patients, and their reasons, they vary, and they're all valid. For people of all ages, it's important to have data from childhood to 80 and beyond. The saying, age is just a number, truly applies. And representation in clinical trial leads to better treatment and access to care for everyone. So this is really, this is important, and I think it just echoes what Dr. Weeks spoke to, is we all want to see our communities benefiting from what is learned in clinical trials. At the heart of these efforts is a shared commitment to the patient, and to ensure we uphold these values, we adhere to several key guidelines and regulations. And these guidelines and regulations listed here are the foundation of our commitment to ethical and high quality clinical research. They help protect your rights and welfare while advancing medical science. If we just spend a few moments looking at these guiding principles, informed consent is crucial. It provides all the information you need about the trial. The consent document can be lengthy. When I started in clinical research, cancer consent documents could be 15 to 20 pages. They are now 40 to 50 pages. And that's a lot of reading. That's a lot of information as a patient to digest and take in, but it's very critical information. And it's important to be fully educated on the trial so that you can make the best decision with your provider and your loved ones and what you want to do. Respect for the individual and the consent process really is essential. And prioritizing your well-being over the interests of science and society is key. And this means that the provider, your doctor, when they offer you a clinical trial, it's to help you and to benefit you, not to meet a quota or because of a conflict of interest. And justice in the selection of research subjects means that the benefits and burdens of research are shared fairly among groups in society, meaning that everyone has an equal opportunity to participate in and benefit from clinical trials, regardless of your background. And so regardless of your background, there are a lot of options out there. There are trials in the neoadjuvant setting, which occurs before surgery, let's say to reduce the size of the tumor and make surgery easier. There are trials in the adjuvant setting, which can take place after surgery or your initial treatment to help ensure cancer cells don't grow back. Additionally, there are trials for cancers or diseases that are progressing or spread, or targeted treatments, as Dr. Weiss was speaking to, that are in the personalized medicine area. And there are phase 1 trials, which sometimes are often seen as a last resort, but they have shown significant advancement. Some FDA accelerated trials have moved quickly from phase 1 due to excellent results benefiting patients and leading to rapid drug approval. And so our advancements in science and technology means that the phase 1 trials today are much more advanced. A lot of trials today are much more advanced than what they were years ago. And there are options and different types of trials to consider. So for those on the call today that have a disease you are fighting, or if you are a caregiving giver supporting someone going through a difficult time, thank you for considering clinical trials as part of your treatment journey. And for my 12th truth to share to you today, as cheesy as it is, it's that those that work in clinical research, whether they are patient-facing or not, we want to help and we're here to support you. So thank you for your time today, wishing you health. And I'd now like to turn it over to Anne.
Thank you, Tiffany. And I want to thank the NCCN as well for this opportunity to present today. You have heard a lot of information about clinical trials, and I can skip that over and just say that I've been doing this for a long, long time, and I too, like Tiffany, really ended up in clinical research quite by accident, and feel that it was really fate looking for me, because for the last 30 years, it has really been a passion of mine. And now I'm in part of a professional advocacy organization called Longevity, which really focuses on lung cancer, which for my clinical research years and a lot of my nursing career was really focused in the lung cancer space. So why do we do what we do as advocates? You've heard today about how important the different phases of trials are and how that builds on to new standards of care and new paradigms in treatment. And without these building blocks, we would not be where we are today in cancer. And one of the great things about having been doing this for so long is that I truly do have that retrospectoscope, and I can actually look back and see how far we have come in the treatment of cancer, all related to clinical trials. It's important that we finish clinical trials as soon as possible. It's economically better for manufacturers, for institutions, and also for patients, because once trials have been completed, this ensures that drugs will be approved sooner, and that gives patients a lot more options as drugs are becoming approved. Patient advocates, as Tiffany alluded to, are really an important part of this whole entire process. We really focus on overcoming some of those barriers that Dr. Weeks had mentioned earlier in the webinar. You know, historically, doctors made the decisions, right? Whatever you say, doctor, is an old adage that hopefully we have come a long way in terms of shared decision making. So it's really important that anyone who's considering a clinical trial be well informed, well educated, have the information they need to make an educated decision about whether this is right for them or not. We can act as liaisons between patients who are considering trials and their physicians. We can help patients really understand clinical trials, find clinical trials, and then find resources in order to help them participate. As Dr. Weeks mentioned, things like travel, just things like even gas cards, gas money to get there, money to afford parking. Many of our cancer institutes have pretty expensive parking these days. So for patients, especially if you happen to be participating in a radiation therapy trial where you have to go every day, parking expenses can really add up. One of the things that we have done quite recently at Longevity is to work on, in a work group nationally, to make clinical trials financially neutral. In other words, it would not cost a patient any more to participate in a clinical trial than to get the standard of care. It's also important that, as Tiffany talked about, that patients have a voice in the design of clinical trials, that nurses and people around the country, maybe in community practice settings where clinical trials may not be offered as often, what are the barriers that their patients have to participating in clinical trials? So ensuring that everyone has a voice in designing clinical trials so that they're easier for patients to participate in. So I noticed that there are several questions in the Q&A section already about understanding how to find a clinical trial, how to know if a clinical trial is right for you, and also how to ask. So I hope in these next couple of slides that we can answer some of those questions. Considering a clinical trial, as Tiffany again mentioned, we have trials that are throughout the entire spectrum of cancer treatment, from pre-diagnosis all the way to side effect and quality of life issues in the post-market setting, as Dr. Weeks mentioned, like a phase 4 trial. So really, any time during treatment is a time to consider whether or not a clinical trial is right for you. It's important to understand what may be available. Do you have a rare cancer? Is there a standard of care for you that has been proven that you should try first? Or is that standard of care up for debate? And perhaps there is a trial that compares newer treatment to that standard of care? Have you failed standard of care and you're looking for something new? Have you had a new biomarker uh, found? I saw someone ask a question about biomarkers, and biomarkers in many of the solid tumors are very important. And I saw that somebody had asked a question about KRAS. It's actually KRAS. And those are all capital letters. It's such an alphabet soup, but it's capital K, capital R, capital A, capital S. And as Dr. Weeks alluded to, many of these tumors do have genetic components to them that change the way that that tumor would be treated, so that there are certain drugs called targeted therapies or the precision medicine. We are discovering more of these all the time. So if you have had a biomarker discovered that there may be a clinical trial out there for, really any time that you want to explore what those possibilities are, it's important to bring that up to your physician. How do you find these trials? Well, and Dr. Weeks even alluded to one of the barriers is that maybe even physicians are not aware of what's out there. So there are many tools today that can help you find a clinical trial. Probably the most common one used is one that is clinicaltrials.gov. It is definitely a worldwide library of clinical trials, and you can, if you're internet savvy, you can actually use the filter system to filter down to just about what you're looking for. If that's daunting to you, certainly calling an advocacy foundation like Longevity, where I work, we help patients find clinical trials for lung cancer all of the time. Doing your own research and actually going to even manufacturer websites and looking to see what kind of trials they may have. Perhaps you live near an NCI designated cancer center. You can actually go to their website and see what trials they may be offering as well. Do your research, read about the trial. What is the purpose of that trial? It's really important going into a clinical trial that you understand what the purpose is. Is it curative? May or may not be. Is it just to maybe slow down the disease or prevent metastasis? Or is it even something more in line with what your quality of life might be while being treated? Perhaps it's really associated with side effect medications or even quality of life questionnaires, so that we can learn more about how a treatment affects you as you're getting it. Eligibility criteria is a really, really important part of this. Eligibility criteria can be a little daunting. It can be very, very specific. So it's really important that you understand where you are in your trajectory of cancer treatment and how you fit into a particular trial. We talked about travel and that consideration of whether or not travel is an option for you. Whether you will have to stay overnight or whether you might have to be an inpatient, or as I said, perhaps it's even just that you have to go every single day and you would need to think about cost of food, parking, gas, those kinds of things need to be considered. Whether or not you need childcare or even pet care or elderly care if you're going to be away from home for a long time. So those are things that also an advocacy foundation can help you arrange. Looking at the risk and benefits, and that's not just to say whether you can be cured or whether you're not going to be cured or whether the experimental arm of the therapy has side effects or not. It's really about how that affects your entire quality of life and whether or not the way you live and the way you want to live will actually fit into that clinical trial. There is a link here to a youtube.com clinical trials video that I think is also very, very helpful. So what should you do if you are considering a clinical trial? First, you want to speak to your healthcare team. They may not be aware, as Dr. Weeks said, that you're even interested in clinical trials. They may not know, but there may be someone in the office, perhaps your physician's nurse or a nurse navigator, that could help you think about what kind of trial you might be appropriate for you and where that trial might be found. Again, doing your own research, looking for trials on your own. You may be the one who brings a trial and makes your physician aware that there's a trial in your disease. Most of the trials that are listed in clinicaltrials.gov will have a coordinator's name and number and institution, and you can actually reach out to them and ask, is this trial still accruing patients? Here's my background. Do you think I might be eligible? Is it worth me coming to be evaluated? Those are things that you can actually reach out to an institution and ask. Maybe you want to talk to somebody who's actually been on a clinical trial. Again, an advocacy organization can help with that. One of the things that longevity offers to patients is to match you one-on-one with another patient who has a disease very similar to yours, and you can then talk to someone who's been in a clinical trial or talk to someone who's undergone the therapy that perhaps your physician is recommending for you. So again, we're strictly lung cancer, but many advocacy foundations have opportunities like that for their community. Then you want to sit down and just formulate some questions. It's always best to write your questions down so that you don't forget something, and to let your care team know, here's my list. I'm bringing a list of questions today. I would like very much to go over with you. So just right up front asking if a clinical trial is recommended for you. If not, why not? If so, why? Are clinical trials best for my type of cancer and the stage of cancer that I have? And if so, what's available? You know, do you have someone here that can talk to me about whether or not a clinical trial is right for me? If not, again, reaching out to an advocacy foundation to see if they have someone that could talk with you. Understanding what treatments you want to really talk about, what's involved in this clinical trial. Is it a randomized trial? Is it just a one-arm trial, meaning there's only one treatment option in this trial? Is there an experimental arm? Is there a drug in this trial that I could not have access to unless I'm in the trial? All of those things are things that you really want to understand. So writing down those questions and asking those questions is important. You know, sometimes, as Tiffany talked about, we may find out something about a trial that's negative, and it's very important that we know that quickly. So yes, it could happen that your trial that you're on would suddenly end or be paused, and that would be unexpected. But usually that's a safety issue, and that's why it's really important that you understand that long consent form to understand why these things might happen. But it's never is the intent to pull the rug out from under you. It's always in your best safety interest. You know, understanding what are the side effects? How are those side effects going to be controlled? Who do I call? Who's my point person? Do I have a lifeline so that if I have any of these issues while I'm on this treatment, I have somebody to reach out to? If this doesn't work, is there another treatment I can get after this? And then, of course, everyone wants to know, you know, what is the cost of clinical trials? And like I just mentioned, Longevity just has participated in a large effort to make clinical trials what we call financially neutral, because we think it's that important that everyone have access to clinical trials. Advocacy groups can definitely help you with all of those basic needs, as I mentioned before. So these are just resources in lung cancer. Almost every disease state in cancer has many of these organizations like this that are specific to your type of cancer. So I would encourage all of you to reach out to those. I want to say that we mentioned diversity early on in the webinar, and I think that, you know, one of the things that we do as a foundation is that we are very committed to making sure that areas that are underserved, populations that are underserved in clinical trials, have access to clinical trials. And we will do everything in our power to help you find a clinical trial if you have lung cancer and you reach out to Longevity. At this time, I would like to turn it back to Tanya, and thank you so much for your questions. I see so many in the Q&A today, and for your participation in this webinar. Tanya?
Thanks, Anne. So thank you again to all of our presenters. The Q&A session will begin shortly. You may now submit your questions and to the presenters. And as Anne mentioned, we do see your questions coming through. So we have all of our presenters. So let's start with this first question. So Dr. Weeks, you mentioned, right, 4 phases of clinical trials. And so is the 4th phase always required? And that what percentage of new drugs have phase 4 trials?
Yeah, so phase 4 trials are sort of done in the background. They're not, they're not sort of specifically done. So the FDA may require sponsors to provide patient-related data as a drug is moving forward. So it does occur for most compounds. And once again, the goal of that is to prevent undue harm to patients. I know there's another question in the chat about drugs being approved that do have significant toxicity. I think at the end of the day, in terms of drugs and safety, the degree of willingness or the degree of toxicity that one is willing to withstand, and one being now the regulatory agencies, is also a function of what the disease is being treated, right? So in the terms of cancer, that's a horrific disease. And so the level of toxicity that is accepted for cancer drugs is higher than, say, a drug for hypertension, right? Where patients can live with hypertension, and so the side effects associated with that medication cannot be as grave as, sort of, say, the side effects associated with, say, a cancer drug.
So I'm reading, so we just this question about kind of advice on how to talk to your physician about when to move to a trial. So I could imagine that it's kind of hard to know as a patient, like at what point is a good point to have this conversation, or can I have it multiple times? I think, I appreciate all the information everyone's given, and it's a lot because it's like, well, my doctor didn't mention a clinical trial, but I want to know more, but I'm going to go to this advocacy group and maybe this website. And I think that can be a lot, especially obviously if you're dealing with cancer or a chronic disease. So maybe some thoughts, some advice on maybe where to start or how to know when side effects are too much. I mean, you don't know how much, you know. Yeah.
Tanya, I'm happy to take that.
Yeah.
I think, as I said, any time is the right time to bring up a clinical trial. You, you know, Even if you're in ongoing therapy, just asking the question about what's next is an important conversation to have with your care team. And when it comes to things like side effects, as an oncology nurse, I will tell you that it's really important that you tell us. We want to know whatever bothers you and is bothersome to your quality of life and your day to day life is important. When you're in a clinical trial, every one of those little things needs to be recorded and reported. So being honest about your side effects, talking to your care team about how you can manage those side effects best is a really, really important conversation. And I would say don't ever be afraid to talk about your side effects. I know that down through the years, many times patients would tell me they didn't want to tell me how bad it was because they were afraid that we would stop the treatment or they would have to go off of a clinical trial. We will only do what's best for your safety. And sometimes your body tells us what we need to know. So never, ever hesitate to tell your team when you're experiencing side effects that affect your daily living. But I would say, yes, and I also saw the question. We could answer that here. You know, if you don't have lung cancer, and you want to talk to an advocacy group, really just using Google and asking, even in your cancer center, your cancer treatment center, you know, where are advocacy groups for pancreatic cancer? Where are advocacy groups for breast cancer? Almost every major cancer group has some major foundations and advocacy groups that work with them, that can always help you to formulate questions, to talk to your care team about clinical trials, to ask the right questions, and to help you decide when that time to bring up that conversation is.
So, I'll take a stab at that question as well. So my main role and how I is to do clinical trials. And so I think on some levels, when you first get diagnosed with cancer, there's a conversation about goals of care. And I think it's important to establish how you want to live with your cancer. So for some patients, clinical trials, you know, that's not consistent with their goals of care. And you can choose to get treated in, so in general, this is not this is not a so in general, doctors who are treating patients at academic medical centers, those doctors they are doing that to do trials in terms of cancer. They're doing some academic pursuit. Whereas in general, uh, doctors who are treating patients in the community are more focused on the general care of patients with cancer. They may do some clinical trials, but doctors tend to choose where they practice based upon what the skill sets that they have and what they want to do with their career. So it is important to establish how the individual patient wants to address their cancer. I would say at any point in time, clinical trials are relevant at any point in time. So there's clinical trials for most any sort of scenario associated with a given cancer. Less common with rare cancers. And with rare cancers, if possible, it may be best to receive care at an academic center where, even though it's a rare cancer, that center may be a center of excellence for that particular cancer, and therefore they may have more clinical trial opportunities, more specialized care opportunities than would be, say, elsewhere. So, on some levels, I think the first step that has to happen is understanding what your diagnosis, prognosis is, and then in that, understanding how you as an individual want to navigate your cancer experience. I think it's also important when selecting a doctor to treat you for your cancer, it's someone that you feel comfortable sharing some of your most intimate feelings with, because at the end of the day, unfortunately, because of the side effects associated with cancer and just the gravity of the disease, there's a lot of communication that has to happen. And if you are not feeling comfortable with that individual, it then makes it very challenging to have conversations about. So, for example, I as a patient, maybe I want to get a second opinion somewhere else. Can you help me get a second opinion? That can be a challenging conversation if you don't have that relationship with your doctor. The flip side is, like me, for example, I may know of trials elsewhere in the country that are relevant to your diagnosis. And if you have the capacity or desire to go seek those trials, and I don't have something I can help you with, I will reach out to my colleagues across the country to see if there's something that can help my patient. And so it's a complex journey. Um, but at the end of the day, to sort of get to the bottom line of that question, really there's probably going to be a trial available for any component of your cancer care. It's just when you want to access that. There's also a question about, if I'm receiving a treatment and it's benefiting me, should I then change to go on to a trial? And I think that's also has to do with your goals of care as well. Um, if you're doing really well and it's working, you know, depending on the cancer that you have, there may not be that many options. So, for example, pancreas cancer, if a patient is getting or receiving a treatment that's working for their pancreas cancer, I would say don't stop that for something that you may not know if it's going to benefit you or not. But if it's something, say lung cancer, for example, where there's not lots, but there's a larger number of therapies, it may make sense to sort of try something while you're doing very well and go back to what you know later. So it really just depends on how you want to approach it.
Mm. Thank you. Very informative. So this is I think, an interesting question. What would someone do um, if they're looking for a clinical trial, but they have two types of cancer, such as, in the example, ovarian and breast?
Yeah, so that is a pretty interesting question. So many phase 2 and phase 3 trials are, once again, I said those trials are designed to ask if there's a benefit of a treatment in a specific patient population.
Mm.
So inherent in that statement is if you have two cancers, you would potentially not be eligible for that type of study, right? Because they are looking at an outcome in one cancer and they don't want that outcome to be influenced by the second cancer. In the setting of phase 1 clinical trials, that becomes less important because the goal of the phase 1 trial is to understand the safety and tolerability of a drug. And in historically, the actual disease the patient had may not have been as important. In today's world with sort of targeted therapies, that's becoming increasingly more important in terms of, do you have the mutation that's being tested? So that is a tricky question, a tricky situation to be in. Some cancers, like say prostate cancer, which is in general a hormonal cancer, trials will allow that. If you say you have breast cancer and you've been treated and now you're getting your sort of 5 years um, of prophylactic therapy, like tamoxifen or whatever, or aromatase inhibitor, some studies will allow that too. So it really just depends on the study and the cancers that we're talking about.
So I see a question about like preliminary results from ongoing clinical trials. So are preliminary results available? How does one access those?
So in general, I would say um, the preliminary results for trials are not generally accessible to the public. And the reason for that is um, they don't want to bias the outcome of that particular study, right? So if for example, there's a trial, so well, let me put it this way. So the preliminary results as it reflects to an outcome are not going to be generally available. It could be that the study is designed. So now there's these types of clinical trials are called basket trials, where there's a number of different arms. They're testing a variety of different things at the same time. They may release the results of one arm as it completes, but the trial itself is still open. So it does happen in some cases, but to maintain statistical integrity in general, that's not done.
Okay. And then there were a couple of questions about Native Americans, American Indians, tribal health, and I know we've all kind of seen the questions. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting about, maybe you can provide just some information on how that data is collected, or how to include those populations in clinical trials, because I know there might be different challenges.
I don't want to take up all the answers, so I can answer the question, all right, so I'll go. So I would say that historically, the person who asked the question is correct, that historically um, Native American populations have not been included in sort of cancer registries that provide the information that is the basis of the slide that I showed. More recently, that is being addressed, and I would say that the NCI, or National Cancer Institute, in the last decade has put a very strong emphasis on this issue and trying to level the the field, if you will, in terms of um, providing increased opportunities for patients of Native American backgrounds to participate in trials. It is, it is, I think that situation can be challenging because you're talking about, in many cases, rural parts of the country, which also have significant barriers to participating in clinical trials. And then you have a subset of a population that um there's sort of a further level of challenges. And I mean, I think academic centers historically have not done a very good job in terms of engaging Native American nations, and it's something that we have to do a better job of. I totally agree with you, um, what I will say is that the cancer healthcare industry um, is noticing this, is trying to think very carefully about how do we get care to everyone, really. And that includes, the big societies that are associated with cancer. That includes the pharmaceutical industry. Um, Really, all aspects of cancer care, really sort of really thinking hard about how to do this, um, such that really every patient who has cancer has the opportunity to benefit from the treatments that we have available.
Yes. So we are out of time, but just wanted to give the presenters an opportunity for any last thoughts, and we'll start with Tiffany.
Hi, everyone. I've been trying to respond back to some questions in the chat, just typing them and getting through. So if you wrote something that I was able to address, I did try to respond back. But thank you for your time today. It was nice to be here with you all.
And Anne, any last thoughts?
Just, I think that this webinar really emphasizes, and with all of us who presented today, how important clinical trials are to the overall aspect of cancer care. And we really appreciate your attention and hope that, if it's appropriate, that you will be able to approach your team to talk about clinical trial participation.
Yeah, I would just say I think information is key, and I am honored to have had the opportunity to speak with you today. And I think it's really about advocating for yourself or your family, advocating for their patients. And we sometimes, as providers, don't want to talk about goals of care, but that's really important as you think about navigating your care and the clinical trial diaspora. So I would just leave you with that.
Yes, ask the tough question, right? I mean, I think sometimes it's just difficult to ask. So we are out of time today, and I want to thank everyone for attending. And I again thank you, our presenters, and the NCCN Foundation would also like to thank the corporate supporters of this webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.